Welcome to everybody who's taken time out of their day today to attend this event. Welcome to another great event planned by the SHAR Alumni Chapter. We represent over 16,000 alumni across a variety of both graduate and undergraduate policy and government degrees. And I'm proud that we're able to organize these types of events to discuss such important topics at the forefront of the public discussion. For those of you who haven't met me, my name is JJ Stakem. I'm the SHAR School of Policy and Government Alumni Chapter Board President, and I'm excited to introduce this important topic, post-COVID-19 return to work for the public sector. We are all acutely aware of the impact that COVID-19 has had on our daily lives and routine. The public sector and the companies that support government have made drastic changes, as have many other sectors of the economy. As we look to the future, our transition out of the pandemic will possibly be one of our biggest challenges to date with the virus. This panel will examine the possibilities for our future, considerations for our workplace and the public sector, and potential local and regional impacts to our economy. Before I introduce our distinguished panel, please let me say a few words about the SHAR School. The mission of the SHAR School the mission of the SHAR School and SHAR School Policy and Government is to advance the public good. We provide our students with the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values to become leaders and managers in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors. We are always looking for opportunities to provide thought leadership on pressing challenges and to engage with our community. We look forward to the opportunity to stay connected with our alumni and community. For updated information on future important topics, Brian Barr, our Director of Alumni Relations, will share a link in the chat window for information about how to stay connected. Also, as we do navigate these challenging times, fundraising is one of our enduring responsibilities as the Alumni Chapter, particularly supporting our Student Emergency Assistance Fund. This fund provides much needed support to current students as we navigate the challenges and impacts of COVID-19 in our community. For those who may be interested in contributing, we would greatly appreciate any alumni contribution. Brian will also provide information below about how to donate. As we get started, I would like to introduce our moderator and panelists. Our moderator is Professor Tojo Thatchin-Carey. He's a professor and director of the Masters in Science and Organization Development and Knowledge Management program at the SHAR School of Policy and Government here at George Mason. He's featured as one of the leading change thinkers in the recently released Palgrave Handbook of Organizational Change Thinkers. He founded the Organization Development and Knowledge Management program at Mason almost 25 years ago. Our first panelist, Ms. Beth Mcgrath, is a global leader for the government and public services industry and a managing director at Deloitte Consulting. Her global role is committed to strengthening synergies across global industries and government and public services with a focus on client mission needs and solutions. As a member of the U.S. Federal Strategy and Operations Practice, she advises federal government and commercial organizations on strategies that help further innovation and improve business operations. Prior to joining Deloitte, she served as the Deputy Chief Management Officer for the U.S. Department of Defense. Dr. Everett Kelly is the National President of the American Federation of Government Employees, which represents over 700,000 federal and DC government employees nationwide and overseas. He assumed the presidency in February of 2020. Everett Kelly has been a member of AFGE since 1981. He worked at the Anniston Army Depot, from which he recently retired after 30 years. And last but not least, Professor Terry Clower. Professor Clower is Northern Virginia Chair and Professor for Public Policy at George Mason University. He also is director of GMU's Center for Regional Analysis. The center provides economic and public policy research services to sponsors in the private, nonprofit, and public sectors. Prior to joining GMU, he was the director for the Center for Economic Development and Research at the University of North Texas. One last logistical note before turning over to Professor Thatchin-Carey. Our format will include a panel discussion until approximately 12:30, at which time we will transition to a question and answer period. Our question and answer period will be moderated, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible. Please type your questions into the Q&A window. Without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to Professor Thatchin-Carey. Thank you.
Thank you, JJ. Well, appreciate all of you joining in for this webinar. the return to work is a metaphor that we are using to capture a huge continuum, sort of a duality. On the one end, we have companies like Spotify, who announced last Friday that every employee can work from anywhere in the world, just not talking about a country, the world. So that is one extreme where a cutting edge streaming company like Spotify is saying that all employees can work from anywhere in the world. We have Salesforce in San Francisco, 40,000 employees, saying last week that almost all of their employees can work remotely three of the 5 days a week permanently. And companies like Microsoft and Google and LinkedIn and etc. have come up with similar policies. On the other extreme, we have a worker in McDonald's or in our local giant grocery store or a CVS pharmacist or a counter clerk who has to go to work. So the return to work is really a metaphor. We have all been working, but we have this continuum of almost near virtual remote setting that could become the future of work to the real in-person scenario. So I will use those two terms. When I say in-person, I'm generally referring to being in a building and working from there, and remote, virtual, etc. mean not having to go to work and then having autonomy and freedom to work the way they would like. Now, in our area, the Washington, D.C., or what I call the National Capital Region area, 83% of the 13 million, 83% of the 30 million folks or employees have been working remotely last several months. Now, that's a huge number. Now, as the vaccine come around, we are hoping that things will change. So we are discussing a transition here that will be profound. Most of the policymakers and management thinkers have said that there is never going to be a true return to the pre-pandemic era. Life is never going to be like 2020 January or February. I assume March is when this thing changed. So there will be profound changes. There will be permanent changes, but we don't know that. So as a university, we are trying to stay at the cutting edge and trying to understand these changes and also be part of that change. We have got a brilliant list of 3 panelists here, and I will ask questions to them, and then I will invite the audience to join us later on. So my first question, before I start with the questions, I would request the 3 panelists to sort of set a context for where are they with this respect to this, continuum that I have just mentioned. The worker in the McDonald's and the grocery chain who has to be in person to folks who can be totally remote, and then our area. What are your thoughts about this new return to work mode, this new future of work that we don't yet know what it will look like, but we are interested in your thought. So I invite you to speak for 3 minutes first before I start with specific questions to each of you. Let me start with Everett, then I will go to Beth and then Terry. Everett.
Okay, thank you, Professor Thatchen Carey. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this important panel. I would like to say good morning or good afternoon to all of the panelists, depending on where you are in America. Far too often, when subjects like the future of work or what matters most to workers are discussed by the experts, the voice of actual workers is left out of this discussion. And so I really want to commend Professor Thatchen Carey and the staff of George Mason University for holding this event and for inviting me. Now, my union, the American Federation of Government Employees, or AFGE for short, represents about 700,000 federal and DC government employees. Now, we work in almost every executive branch agency, from DOD to DHS to VA to SBA, HUD, DOL, DOJ, Census, and more or less everything in between. Now, our largest concentration of members, however, are in the biggest agencies, DOD, VA, and DHS. And we represent workers in all kinds of jobs, blue-collar workers in the skilled trades and in service jobs like the commissaries on military bases and all kinds of white collar technical and professionals in healthcare, engineering, law, statistics, environmental science, IT, and more. Professionals and warehouse workers might not seem to have much in common beyond working for the same employer, the federal government, but the truth is that they do. Of course, there are obviously government-wide issues like pay and benefit, collective bargaining and due process rights, paid leave and hours of work. But there are other sometimes less obvious kind of issues that unite all federal and DC government workers have to do with the ability to get and keep a job on the basis of objective qualification rather than political loyalty. We used to take that for granted until the previous administration came along. Now it's probably issue number one in the minds of employees who never thought that they would be prevented from doing their job for the American people in order to align with their boss' political agenda. Another issue is pay. Since the focus of this panel is post-pandemic, I would offer to you that for federal employees, after years of pay freezes or many raises that just justified by phony concerns for the deficit, are really ready for some serious improvement in compensation. There's been plenty of rhetoric during this pandemic about frontline workers being heroes and how much we need to show our appreciation. Probably close to half of all federal employees have had to work at their regular duty stations throughout the pandemic. Correctional officers, for example, in federal prisons, healthcare workers at the VA, DOD, NIH, CDC, and Indian Health Services, TSA officers, FEMA workers, Border Patrol agents, customs agents, meat and poultry inspectors at the Agriculture Department. Workers from all these agencies have lost their lives to COVID as a result of getting infected by work, at work rather. And almost everyone from all these agencies who had to keep working on the front line during the pandemic had to struggle and fight for personal protective equipment or PPE. Our union had to struggle and fight for workers' compensation benefits for victims and their families. Simply put, the pandemic showed how little the lives and health of federal employees matter to many lawmakers and politicians. At the very least, federal workers want future compensation and show some respect and appreciation for the sacrifice and devotion that they have shown not only during the pandemic, but also in the years before when their benefits were cut, when they were treated with, threatened rather with outsourcing and firing for political reasons, and when they were deprived of the resources necessary to carry out their duties. President Biden issued an executive order on his third day in office. That order orders agencies to undo some of the damage that the previous Trump administration did when it comes to collective bargaining rights. And although it would take some time to fully implement, that is extremely welcome. But a post-COVID federal workforce that was already under attack and was left to fend for itself when it came to PPE and other accommodations to COVID is ready for some serious improvement in pay, benefits, and respect.
Thank you. Thank you, Everett. I appreciate that's a good way to share your views. Now, let me ask Beth about her thoughts about this topic. Beth.
Thank you. And I too appreciate the opportunity to join this group in this conversation this morning, and to Dr. Kelly's comments. The voice of the people or the federal workforce or the state workforce is incredibly important. And as was mentioned, spending 25 years in the Department of Defense, I appreciate, I'll say, that inclusion. You know, what's been interesting for me as I've been out of the federal workforce for the last 7 years and has been mentioned, I look globally across government work. So in many different countries, certainly very much in the US, but in every other country, there are challenges as it relates to, and I appreciate that return to work is a metaphor, but I do think it's important that we keep saying that. But the challenges associated or the conversations associated with return to work, I think they feel very universal in terms of, you know, how are we taking care of the people? What are we doing in terms of their, not only all the benefits that, you know, Dr. Kelly mentions, but also how do we enable them a safe space to take care of their families and themselves? And what's interesting pre-COVID is the conversation around the future of work was really driven by technology. And so if you think about it, you know, the workforce and workplace. Here we're talking about, you know, the sort of the workplace and how do we get back to whatever the new normal looks like. I don't have a crystal ball. Well, I have a crystal ball. It just doesn't work very well. But I do know that, you know, when we get back to whatever the new normal is, it will not be where we came from, which I think is a good thing. And what's been super interesting, as I mentioned, sort of workforce and workplace was really driven by sort of how does technology enable us as, you know, people and economies to move forward. And I really feel that COVID has accelerated sort of digital modernization, in particular in government. It has provided an opportunity for speed. And I've seen that universally. I've seen the appetite for digital, you know, really increase. But I also have seen sort of attacks on the workforce because the boundaries for work and home used to be very clear, well, clearer. You know, you get in your car and you drive home, you are now no longer at work, although you might be working. Now we live and work in the same environment. And so there's been a real, you know, additional pressure sort of put on the workforce. And so as we think about the new normal, whether it be, you know, 2 days a week or 3 days a week, and for those who deal, as Dr. Kelly mentioned, on the front lines, or, you know, our service providers, or those who deal with classified, I mean, their normal is still not normal, but it is every day in the office. And the question is, you know, how do you design, you know, an environment where it allows people flexibilities to both sort of take care of themselves, take care of their families, get the work done, you know, hold people accountable, and have additional communication and transparency. So I think it's a great time to have the conversation. I think it will require us to use different muscles than we have before. And I look forward to the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. You've shared some very deep insights, and I hope we can build on those. Let me now request Terry to share his thoughts.
Sure. Thanks, Tojo. I think to put it in a context as we look going forward, it's interesting to think where we have come in terms of the way we practice business over the last, decade or more. Economic development, the location of where businesses choose to do their business, you know, was still an artifact of the industrial age. We thought about in terms of markets, you know, access to supplies, your raw materials, access to markets and all that. Obviously, as we've shifted more and more into a post-industrial economy, that goes away a little bit. And really what we have seen in the last few years is this recognition that economic development is really about any entities, whether it's government or private sector business, their ability to attract and retain talent. That has become the dominant factor. So much different than it was, say, even 10 years ago. Our workers are the ones that are going to be calling some of the shots about this. And you're going to see some companies at the leading edge. You know, you mentioned Spotify, Twitter, and some others that are really doing this, and particularly the impacts on very high cost of living areas, San Francisco, DC, New York. So there's going to be a real changing balance. But then we have kind of the factors that go into this. Our ability and our willingness to deploy the technologies to help us actually do this work. Many of us do work that has some degree of security. So you think about what you have to have in terms of dispersing a secure apparatus. 5G technologies are going to help with some of that. And of course, the DC region is pretty well placed. We are among the earliest areas to get rollout of 5G technologies, and seeing that. How we deal with individual security issues will be dealt with by individual organizations, contractors, the federal government. But then we also think about that balance of the social side of it. And how do we do that? Tojo, you and I are used to occasionally seeing each other in the hallway and stopping and having a conversation just casually about the work that we're doing. You know, we haven't figured out yet how to turn on water cooler innovation through Zoom, although we're trying mightily, even through events like this one. The other element is the degree to which in early parts of our career, we rely so much on our networking and our mentorship networks in the workplace. And we haven't quite, this is so new, we haven't quite figured out how you're going to implement that. And then, as Dr. Kelly suggested, this whole issue of being able to make sure that through our approach of doing this, our employees across different groups treated equally, fairly in their ability to do that. And I think very much the question for the federal government is, do they want to lead in this and really help push and help their contractors decide the best way to do this? Or are they going to sit back and just respond and let the private sector deliver? But that's going to make it harder for federal agencies to actually attract and retain the best talent in that. So they have a real, this is an opportunity where federal government working with the labor organizations that represent the workers, as well as the contractors, to figure out the best way forward.
Thank you, Terry. What I'm learning from your three comments from our panelists is that we've got to talk about a range of issues. So my questions are going to cover most of it. I'm hearing issues about social capital, networking. How do we sort of substitute for that in-person human element that we have been so used to? What is the role of technology in creating the new workspace? And then what about the racial and economic inequity that we have seen across the continuum of the workforce? We have seen that the rich has become richer and the poor has become poorer. So there are really public policy issues here as well. So I would frame these questions to the three panelists, and then later on we will have an opportunity to hear from the audience as well. So my first question, I'm going to ask Dr. Kelly. As president of the largest federal employee union representing 70,000 workers, what are the top two challenges that you might face in a post-pandemic return to work scenario?
Well, thank you, Professor. Now, two of the top two challenges for returning to work have to do with making sure that both transportation and to and from the workplace is safe, and that the workplace itself is safe. Now, I must take exception to the phrase return to work, just as you have said and others have said. Federal employees have been working every single day throughout this pandemic. What I would like to say is a return to the workplace, but we certainly have been working. Work hasn't ended. For those who have been teleworking, however, the biggest concern continues to be safety. Access to the vaccine varies tremendously among the states. There has been no consistent whatsoever in who is eligible for a vaccine between one state and another. And therefore, nationwide, back to the office order need to take into consideration the huge differences in access to vaccination. Another problem is that no one knows the long-term effectiveness of the vaccine against newer strands of the virus. So there is still a lot of concern about even vaccinated people going back to the office. No matter what, there have to be fundamental changes, in the interior architecture of offices to allow social distancing, hygiene, and a continued options to telework regularly.
Thank you. That's a very important issue, Dr. Kelly, that we must explore further. Let me ask a related question to Beth in this scenario, and that is, we have heard, this is very anecdotal. We don't have, we haven't done research yet. It happened too fast. Yet we have heard both management professors and policy folks and company CEOs, etc., saying that many organizations are getting better productivity from their workforce. Google CEO, Sundar Pichai has said it many times that his employees in Google have become more productive. Is this true? How do we know what is really going on? So to Beth, the question is, she's a leader of the global industry and government and public service at Deloitte, dealing with hundreds and hundreds of employees. What have you observed, Beth, in this regard? Has the productivity gone up, or we don't know?
Well, I would, this is a typical, consultant answer. It depends. So I would say absolutely. There's evidence, and actually more than anecdotal evidence, that says yes, we're more productive. We can see, like we have to charge our hours, especially with any of, in accordance with all the, I'll say contracting and accounting systems. And so we have to allocate our time every day, and you can see, greater utilization through the workforce. What the other part is the burnout. I think I mentioned, there are no boundaries anymore. But you see, I'm in my home, which is my workplace, which is my sort of everything, and it is the same for everybody else. And so I think what we haven't gotten a full appreciation for really is the burnout of our employees. They're taking less leave, which is not a good thing, which means they're not taking care of themselves, which means their productivity will decrease. And so while in the short term, yes, definitely increase in productivity, once we all figured out, I'll just say how to work from home and where to work and how to figure out all these Zoom and Teams and everything else that we're doing. But I feel like it's, it's an and. Yes, productivity has increased, and it's having an impact on the workforce.
Sure. So a quick follow-up question, Beth, in that regard is, in a way, you are talking about the mental health issues, and in federal government and in all agencies and private sector, et cetera, we have talked about, the concept of well-being and work-life balance, and work-life balance gets a new meaning in this scenario. So at least there are three aspects of the work life, that is, one is the work, and the second is childcare if you have children, and how do we make sure that they are attended to, and helping them with their schools if you have small children at home, and then employee well-being. Are they able to spend time for their own personal care? And as the distinction between work and life become less evident or clear, have you seen any practices that you, as a senior leader in a big firm like Deloitte or others, have used to create some kind of work-life balance? And then what might that look like in the new normal work we are talking about?
Yeah, thank you. And I manage teams of people, and you're always taking a look at like how is everybody doing, and the points that have been made up until now have been, it's harder to interface with people because, you set up a Zoom coffee chat, or you do a Zoom walk, or you do some sort of walk. And so you have to be creative about how to interface with your team. And, it has really been, I'll just say, a challenge to make sure that people are taking the time for themselves. And that you set up boundaries. We actually in Deloitte, the question before, like we sent everybody home in March. Nobody's coming back. We don't have a set date for folks to come back. There are a couple of offices open across the United States. There are safety protocols in place, all the signage and cleaning and all those things. So that we've got the safety of our people at the forefront, but we also then want to take care of them. So providing them, hey, if you can't work because you've got now childcare issues that you didn't have before, we put practices in place to help them. We talk and we talk and we talk about it. It's okay to have a challenge at home. Tell your teammates, and we're going to help, together get through all these things. But it was, a sort of a message from the top that said to folks, we're in this together. We are here for you, the employee, because we are a people business. We must take care of our people. And so it's just incredibly important. So, communication, setting boundaries, doing non-video things is very welcome as well. and those kind of things really, help the employees understand that it's okay to need to do something else, and that you've got someone to help.
Mhm. Thank you, Beth. So you have actually given me an opening to ask some questions about employee engagement, but I'll hold on to that and come back to you, all three panelists, later on with that. Let me now make a shift to Terry. As you know, he's our director of the Center for Regional Analysis, and he's always thinking about what's happening in our economy in the National Capital Region. Not just the real estate, as he mentioned in his opening statement, the concept of social networking and the interface between people being in a workspace versus remote, and how that impact various aspects of our economy. So in that context, my question to you, Terry, my colleague, is that the most recent data from BLS show over 23% of the nation's workers continue to work from home. And that number is substantially higher when focused on professional services, which dominate our region, as you know. So as director of this Center for Regional Analysis, what trends are you seeing regarding how many people will continue to work from home as we get the pandemic under control? In other words, in the post-pandemic era, if you may have to think about a post-pandemic scenario after the vaccine and all that, what trends will you see? Do you see an permanent shift in that regard? Terry.
Yeah, so thank you, Tojo. I think what we will see in many respects is just a continuance of a trend that was already happening in our region. And forgive me for that, my background keeps flopping in and out, so you're seeing part of my rather unkept office here at the house. But in any case, keep in mind that we were already seeing trends where employers, in order to retain their best workers, particularly among some of the younger workforce, were already starting to say, you can telecommute a couple of days a week, 1 day, 2 days a week. This was a trend that's already started. And going back to something you were mentioning, productivity, one of the reasons productivity has increased is simply because without changing our off time, we have gained a lot because of the degree to which traffic congestion is so terrible in our areas. In the DC metropolitan region, something on order of about 18% of us commute more than an hour each way to and from work. So if you think about it, if we're working from home without doing anything, we've kind of recaptured a couple of hours for part of us, and then for many more of us. Now, that doesn't say the part where so what we have learned as being commuters is how to use that time, whether you're sitting on a metro train and you're reading the paper, or if you are listening to an audio book while in your car. I'm not sure how that good is well for attention on the traffic around you, but nonetheless, there has been some of that adaptation. Still, there are the boundary issues, but there are a couple of factors. So I think in part, we're going to see this as just almost validating a trend that was already starting. The question is, for most of our workers, it's probably not something that we can all go and live in Bora Bora, Tahiti or something or another, but where is that balance? How many days a week really works out to where we get the innovation, the water cooler innovation from going, and working together face to face versus the being able to sit out. If I just take a look at our occupation mix in this region, and not trying to get real scientific with it yet, I'd say about a third of our workers are in occupations that can do remote work of some way or another. And that's over 1 million workers, and you figure out the balance of that, right? So I think that there will be some substantial portion of that, whether it is, 10% of those workers or 20% or 30% of those workers, we simply don't know yet, but it would not surprise me for that number to be north of 20% of that worker set. But then we start thinking about how those impacts flow throughout the economy, because if you have, let's say you have 10 or 15% fewer people showing up to the offices, that's fewer people that are having lunch at the local diners around the offices. or the fewer people, or the number of times you need to have your shirts or your suits taken to the dry cleaners. So there is an entire service industry that has built over the years around servicing people who are going to an office place. And I think we're going to see some real impacts on those. And then, of course, you even think about the office market. You know, how much office space does any of us need, you know, whether we're a federal government space or any of that, and what that does to the market. I mean, and you think about this, the effects have not shown up yet tremendously in this region because of the terms of rental, you know, space rental. But if we saw a dramatic increase in vacancy rates, our net absorption, not counting pre-leases of new buildings, was about a loss of about 600,000 square foot. That's not that big in terms of our overall market, but we could easily see a 15 or 20% reduction in overall office demand. And then you think about the knock-on effects of services to buildings, the people that provide those services that are oftentimes some of our most vulnerable populations. And then you also think about the impacts on local government taxes.
Sure. That's a very good point, Terry. As you know, in the Shar School, in fact, you know, Arlington campus of George Mason, we experienced that very issue about space and services. You know, we have housekeeping and cleaning services, which is generally a contracting job, and one of the employees didn't have adequate health insurance, and other financial you know, emergency came up, and she didn't have anywhere to go. So the Shar School faculty, thanks to one of my colleagues, started a GoFund campaign and raised $10,000 to help her. But that is just one example. How about the other thousands of folks who are like that, who are hurting? And that's the question I would like to ask Dr. Kelly, that you know, the remote work environment has brought to work to surface the huge income and racial inequity that we face in our country. What will you do on behalf of the thousands of workers you represent as the president of the association, union, to address this issue as they return to the workspace in whatever way or form? It may not be complete, yet that there will be changes. And as a president of the largest union, you have a huge responsibility there. And I'm curious as to how you will address that, Dr. Kelly.
Thank you again, Professor. Now, there is no question at all that some of the disparities in who gets infected with COVID had to do with, who had to continue to go to work. We have many workers at the VA whose duty stations is the hospital. They are laundry workers, food service workers, janitorial staff, people who do intake and who work all over the hospital, but don't have any kind of healthcare certification. They had no PPE provided to them. They were treated as expendable. We had grocery store and other commissary workers on military bases. Their safety was certainly not a priority for the previous administration, and it has something to do with their administration's lack of respect for low-wage workers and workers of color. Now, that has changed with the new administration, and since efforts are underway to vaccinate everyone and provide everyone with PPE and pay equality. So we'll fight for pay equality. Now that will become a priority as well. Federal workers are paid on an average 23.1% less than their private sector counterparts, according to the Federal Salary Councils. Those pay gap reductions must be attributed to the 1.9 and the 3.1% pay raise that federal employees received in 2019 and 2020. The pay gap is a national problem, not just a local problem, not just but it's in every town, it's in every city, every suburb where job candidates can often opt for the bigger private sector paycheck. There is also a gender disparity as well. Women in the federal workforce earn 93 cents for every dollar made by a man, and that was in 2017, and that hadn't changed much. So we'll be fighting for these, and we'll be fighting to ensure that there's a priority put on pay equality as well.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly. I want to return to something that came up earlier among the three panelists' comments, and you had discussed, work-life balance and mental health, etc. That brought up the issue of employee engagement for me, and also JJ, who runs a company. We have discussed this issue with some agencies about employee engagement, which is a big thing in federal government and any organization. And it has a specific meaning, and there is a survey of employee engagement, and agencies are compared. And if you're not on the top of the list, you're worried as the secretary of that agency and so on. So in the new work environment, again, when we discuss the return to work space or return to work as a metaphor, and which is going to be a continuum of some people having more flexibility to work and some people not having enough flexibility, this concept of employee engagement is going to take a new form. Most of the employee engagement surveys and procedures and trainings were designed on the premise that people go to work and they interact with their colleagues and subordinates and their leaders, and things happen, and some people feel very committed. Some people feel less. It has to do with organizational culture and all those things. But in the new work mode, which is this continuum and which is continuously shifting, employee engagement is going to look different. And yet it's a very important aspect for all sorts of productivity, which I had mentioned earlier. So when Sundar Pichai, Google CEO, said that their productivity went up, did he also mean that the employee engagement went up? We don't know that. So let me start that question with Beth. At Deloitte, I'm sure you must have dealt with this issue. Then I will also ask the same question to Dr. Kelly. Beth, what do you think about employee engagement?
Yeah, and I think I think I was alluding to this before, and having spent, like I said, 25 years in the government, part of the employee survey, I think our going in position is that that supervisors, managers, and team captains, if you will, are engaging their employees sort of appropriately. And I would sort of challenge that a little bit, as we look to, how are things different now in a mostly remote or a, COVID-driven environment. And I would say, in both instances, it really requires the supervisor, the team captain, however you're organized, even if it's a sort of a team-based something that you're doing, is that, understanding sort of what drives your people, and that not everybody is the same. And, I'll just say, for years, I coached basketball. If you could see me, you'd see I'm, 6'5", maybe not. Maybe it's 5'6". But my point is that, like, every person is different, and so when you're a coach and you're trying to maximize the performance of your player, it is to sort of bring the best from them. It requires a different approach, for each person. And so, my approach has been, and I think it's important that as supervisors and sort of team captains, I'll use that, is that we deliberately engage our people. And in sort of the COVID environment, it's as we've talked about, it's Zoom or Teams, and boy, if people just don't like to be on camera because they just don't like to be on camera, then talk to them on the phone, but understand them, as opposed to applying your thoughts for you to other people. And so I think this whole notion of sort of engaging the employee, it takes more deliberate action, I believe, in a COVID-based environment. And as I mentioned, some of the things that I'm seeing, broadly, are these like Zoom coffees, or we have open office hours. There's no agenda. We just have people in a Zoom room. We have leaders, partners in a Zoom room, and anybody can come and talk about whatever they want. It's, could be a brown bag, it could be whatever, but it's time dedicated to hearing the employees and engaging with the employees. And I do feel that, it must be a deliberate act, and it must be done every day. And I think it is harder in the COVID world because our schedules are all the time. We don't bump into people, as Terry mentioned earlier, unless we're all trying to get, in the office for a particular time so you can have quiet. Those kind of things. And so it really must be deliberate and must be thoughtful.
Sure.
And that's what we're seeing.
Thank you, Beth. You have also in the process shared some of the best practices, small things you can do like the Zoom coffee and other things that can make a difference. As human beings, we are always looking for that social connection. Let me now ask Dr. Kelly to respond to what Beth said. She gave a side of employee engagement practices that they have helped create and work with various agencies, etc. But I also know that as representing the union, you've dealt with this issue a long time, employee engagement surveys and so on. But in the new work scenario that we still don't know how that will look like, what are the issues, or how can we address, or how can we create better employee engagement in the post-pandemic scenario?
That is a very good question. Okay, now, I must say there's no question that this pandemic will create some kind of a new normal, right? It's no doubt about it. But I've been extremely surprised as to how seamless my union has been able to continue with this representational work. The technology that allows remote meetings and face-to-face conversations has really proven its worth. Now, but when we think in terms of, employee engagement and how we get employees engaged, I have to go back, 4 years, right? It's been virtually impossible for employees to really be engaged with the management officials because of especially beginning in 2018, when the Trump administration issued 3 executive orders that actually took away collective bargaining, gutted the contracts for federal employees, kicked them out of business, out of their office spaces, and those type of things, in a way, of chilling the effect of the bargaining unit. When I say bargaining, I'm talking about the employees, working with their unions. Okay, and in order to really create an atmosphere where there is absolute employee engagement, we're going to have to go back to if I may, Trump era, where there were partnerships between the agencies and the bargaining unit through their union. And I'm very grateful to what President Biden has done so far. And that is, he came in and on his 3rd day, he revoked or reversed those 3 executive orders. Now, it's going to take some time in order to get it, into play, but in order to have real engagement, you're going to have to go back to where, the management are not afraid to engage with the union and the workforce for fear of the political appointees, breathing down their neck. And actually, that's why I'm so glad that the Schedule F was actually revoked as well, that executive order, because that would have even allowed more opportunities for political appointees to make decisions versus, the career ladder employees. And so I think that we got to get back to that era or something similar before we can really have real employee engagement.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I have just one more question before I want to start hearing the many questions that we are getting from our audience. And so let me ask that question to Terry, and then we will go to getting the questions from the audience. And this is something, Terry, you might have addressed a bit, but if there's something still to be said about this, feel free. And the question is, what factors will drive private sector decisions in not allowing or allowing, letting happen, the encouraging work from home? In other words, what are the considerations the private sector will have in making that call about how long or how much should their employees work from home, even though they are generally working for the government as private contractors and so on. Once you respond to that, we will go to the audience questions. Terry, your thoughts?
Oh, sure. And I'll be brief so we can get to the folks' questions quickly. But I think it goes to just a couple of things that what companies and federal agencies, quite frankly, are going to have to figure out. And I think Beth is probably has addressed this a little bit also, but it's that finding that balance of being able to offer what the employees are going to want to see themselves in terms of workplace flexibility about where they show up. I think there's going to be also and that's going to include the flexibility of changing your relative portions of in-office versus working at home as life circumstances change, or just for mental health. I mean, let's face it, some of us, I'm quite sure that my wife is probably tired of this unrelenting togetherness we've had over the last several months. You know, she wants me to go to an office someplace, I'm quite sure. But, you know, so there is a little bit of that, but people, you know, that flexibility. But there is the the physical infrastructure. Do you have the right bandwidth going into your home? Do you have the right equipment in your home? The dispersal, if you think about the federal rules about employees being able to take government-owned equipment home and, you know, and maintaining it there and the servicing of that equipment, or for those that, you know, I can even see the idea that somebody will create the business model of a kind of sort of WeWork space that have almost skip level security, that you don't commute into the DC office, but you go to someplace out in Winchester that there's, you know, for today or for the next couple of days, I can go work and I know that it is a technologically a communication secure facility so that I can do some type of work. Having said all that, I think the technology exists to do all of these, but it's going to require investment in that technology. And it's going to, you know, and it will be an investment that will have a return. But as Dr. Kelly can attest to very well, we sometimes in the political process don't look to invest in the workers of the federal government and treat it as something that generates a return on investment. And we do the same thing even with the technologies. We get hung up, you know, when will we get back to worrying so much about deficits that we don't invest properly? And of course, for the contractors, they have to think about being able to do that, but within the framework of what the federal government will allow them to build back. So there's some real management challenges that we have, and I have faith that we can work through it eventually, but let's say that we'll do better if we work through it effectively to begin with. And it's going to be that engagement with the workers and understanding that whatever somebody wants to do today in terms of their workplace decision can shift from time to time. That's how we deal with the real problems that we come up when we're talking about family medical leave and these kind of things. Can you create flexibility that keeps talented workers engaged in your workplace, but allows them to address the circumstances that happen in life?
Good point. Thank you, Terry. Let me now transition to the questions from the audience. We received one question in advance, even before we started, and that's something, Terry, you have sort of addressed, but let me at least read that to you. And one particular part is about the cost of living. So the person asked that the question is like this: the federal government leases many facilities throughout the United States, costing taxpayers millions of dollars each year. With the federal government increasing maximum telework and possibly leaning that way for the future, how do you see the real estate landscape and the migration of federal employees out of the DC area to lower cost of living areas? This has already happened in San Francisco. Will it happen here? What do you think?
Yeah, it could, but you know, we have an interesting thing of looking back, and there will be a psychology to this. Mm-hmm. So as you might remember, a couple of years ago, the agriculture department basically force relocated workers in a couple of very important agencies that were in research type of agencies. And I believe Dr. Kelly was Kansas City or something. And not to say that things are not nice in Kansas City, but if you think about that point, a good portion, and I forget, I believe it was about half of the workers basically retired or resigned instead of moving out of this area. A lot of federal workers like the notion of actually being where headquarters is. It's a, career opportunities, it's connections, social connections, and all that. Now, there's the psychology difference of, I'm not going to move if you tell me to, but if you tell me I can, I may choose to move. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But I think the overriding thing is this: if you are a career federal worker, the seat of opportunity is still going to be the District of Columbia and the surrounding jurisdictions. So I think it's a little different than the private sector of, choice of being in San Francisco. Having said that, there will be some movement. Yeah, definitely there will be some. I just don't think it's going to be a mass exodus.
Well, one way or other, we hope that there will be some reduction in the rent poor people have to pay and the cost of buying a new house, which become very unaffordable to even the middle class. So let's hope at least some improvement will happen in that area. Let me go to some of the questions from the audience. We have got lots of questions, and we may not be able to get all of them, but I'll try to categorize them and ask specifically to one of you, and then feel free to respond other panelists as well. So one of the questions is about successful strategies that have taken to help senior leaders who resist remote working to overcome mindset like, if my employees aren't here, you're not working. So question is, if you have a leader who says that, if you're not here, you're not working, what can you do? Let me start with Beth, since she must have heard that question before.
Thanks so much. It's fascinating. People are fascinating. And I'll just say, while I was in government, I was sort of trying to change the way that the Defense Department does business. And this whole culture, it's culture eats strategy for pick a meal, like, breakfast, lunch. And that is so incredibly true. And, I feel like the power of COVID made, believers out of some, not all, who thought that if I don't see you, you must not be working, because they were forced into, a place they were uncomfortable themselves, just innately uncomfortable getting there. And while I think, some have migrated, others, still they come in, they're looking for other people. And they're like, where is everybody? And you have to remind them, hey, there's still a pandemic happening. And, not everybody has a vaccine. And so, we must do this. But it's also a terrific opportunity to sort of get them to rethink. I personally don't think we can change the hearts and minds of everyone. I do feel, however, that as a leader of an organization, this is a tremendous opportunity for you to take a look at this whole, the work you do, how you do the work, and where you do the work. It is, and so for any leader out there, like, now's the time. Because if there was ever a time where, you could introduce flexibilities that you otherwise couldn't, or you get, all kinds of, status quo policy pushback, now's the time to do it. And the other thing, and it's sort of piling on to some of what Terry said about the, government contracts. This is a great time to look at all those contracts and look and see, where do you require the work to be done? Is it on-premise, government premise, or is it off-premise? And you could actually save money by not having, contractor workforce be in government facilities if they don't need to be there. And I'm not saying it fits, one size for sure does not fit all, but there are flexibilities. If I feel like now is the time, we have the permission, and we need to take the step.
Thank you, Beth. I know that our other panelists might have something very insightful to share that, but in the interest of allowing more questions to be heard by the three of you, let me shift to another question, and I may come back to this later on for other panelists, but the other question is about how the pivoting to this new environment, making this transition to the new work mode. If you were to compare the public, private, and the nonprofit, did one sector do better? That is a question. In general, which sectors, that is profit, non-profit, or private, did a better job of pivoting, that is, and then will those who pivoted the best at the beginning, will they end up having an advantage, a competitive advantage? Will they be ahead in returning to the more regular in-person work? And I will let all three of you to respond to it if you have anything specific here. Should I, Kelly, Dr. Kelly, do you want to say anything about this?
Well, what I would say is this, and I can't, and I don't have the data on the private sector, okay? But I will say this, that as far as, the employees that I represent, federal and DC government workers, being in this pandemic has forced us, right, to work from home. And I must say that productivity has been up, okay? And I don't think that we'll ever, because of that, I don't think that we'll ever return to just, a full in the office type of work environment because of that. Now, I don't know if it's because of the, less distractions. I do know, just from my own personal being, is that you work a whole lot more when you're working from home. I do know that, right? And so I don't know that, but I do think that, we will see this begin to come more and more. And there were some private industries that actually started this before the pandemic and was getting good results. So I just think that it's going to be something that will go on and on into our future. I think it is the future of work.
Okay, thank you. Others, anything else to add to that? Otherwise, I'll go to the next question.
Actually, Beth said it earlier, and it is the consultants and the economist creed that it depends, because it so much depends on whether or not your employees are publicly facing or have to be engaged. So you're thinking about the difference in nonprofits that are advocating for positions, doing, they're lobbying for groups, and they can do so relatively remotely, versus people that are working at the food bank who have all of a sudden had to adjust to tremendous increases in the number of clients coming in, needing support as folks have lost their jobs in the leisure, hospitality, retail sectors, during this pandemic. So it very much depends. Having said that, we've seen resiliency in lots of elements of our society. One of those is that total retail sales have not really gone down. There's been some shifting, but retailers have done a good job of figuring out ways of continuing to encourage us to take money out of our pockets electronically and send it to somebody else. And so I think that we have demonstrated a remarkable resilience, even with some of the political stuff that's gone on. I think we have demonstrated that we can adapt to this. And I'm not going to say it's going to be all smooth, but I don't see the clear lines of distinction that I might have expected 30 years ago of expecting differential performance and flexibility among the federal workforce, the state and local government workforce, and the private sector, which speaks largely to how the workers themselves have adapted to the way they do their jobs and the way they're, it's a different environment than it was 30 years ago.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the next question is a tough one to answer, and he has already told me, don't say it depends, okay? So his question is, are companies going to, or will employees price companies that allow for work from home? In other words, is there a premium on this, and how is that going to impact, the economy? And he says, don't say it depends.
I'm happy to start. Well, I'll give my colleagues an opportunity to come up with some better words than I have. What we've seen pre-pandemic is there are certainly some skill sets that are just incredibly difficult to find. And, to use one that probably everyone will recognize is cyber. So cyber talent and And so there's tech, and then there's cyber, and all the flavors that, cyber comes in, recon, offense, defense, et cetera. And in the government, we couldn't find enough when we couldn't keep them. Same in the private sector. And now with, and if you have a skill set that is just super hot in the market, you've got leverage, and you should use that leverage. And now what we're seeing with, I'll just say COVID, is you can work from anywhere in the United States, and as I think with Spotify, anywhere in the world. And so if you are sort of that good at what you do and have this skill set that is in demand, I think you can put that on the table and say, but hey, I want to work in, wherever you want to work. What will need to be, I'll say, discussed is, if that employer, has contracts with the government that require, them to be on site, they would have to sort of agree to, okay, I'm going to be on site. But I do think the open-mindedness around sort of where do you call home or your home base is completely on the table. And, I think we had discussed some of this, it's a buyer market or a seller's market. It feels like, for some of these skill sets, it's definitely, an employee market. And which is why it's so important for, I'll just say, to throw in that people keep abreast of sort of and keep, continuing to make themselves sort of better and more marketable, and understand where sort of work is going and the tech-enabled nature. So I 100% think it's different. And if I was this, super great skilled cyber person, or again, I use that as my example, any of those in-demand skill sets, I would be, putting those sort of conditions on the table as part of an employment package.
Thank you, Beth. That's a very insightful answer. And in fact, I got a request from Billy Trost, who said he can answer this question. It's rarely to see somebody who says, I can answer a question. Billy, did you say that? And if you did, come alive and say what your answer is. Billy Trost. Unless I misunderstood the comment.
Hello. I'm not Billy Trost, but he was just saying that question was going to be answered live.
Okay. Sorry, I misunderstood that. All right. Well, it's hard to sort these things out. I didn't want to be insensitive to anyone. Well, we have a very interesting question about the generational divide. And that is, I think, something we didn't really talk about yet, but I'm sure it's in the minds of all of you. That is there a generational divide when it comes to that comfort level to be fully present and comfortable and thriving in this new work mode, whatever that might be? Have you seen anything at all in that regard? The common sense says that the younger employees are, more comfortable with technology. They know Instagram and all this new media, but is that the main dimension? So have you observed any generational divide at all? So let me ask this question to all three of you, Beth, Dr. Kelly, and Terry. Beth, have you observed it in your private sector experience?
Yes. However, so as a sort of a mother of, I think, a millennial and a Gen Z, I sort of witness it all the time. And the adaptability of I'll call the younger generation is super high. In their sort of definition of work and value and contribution is different than, I'll say, when I entered the workforce 100 years ago. And so I feel like definitionally it's different. And culturally, as I mentioned before, I was in the Department of Defense for 25 years. My kids don't think of what am I going to do for the next 25 years. They're thinking of, do I like what I'm doing now? And am I, feeling, valued, and am I contributing now? And for as long as they're doing that, then they're happy. As soon as they're not, they pivot to something else. And if, they want to come back, they come back. They're a lot more agile in their just thinking, at least this has been my experience, and then certainly someone from, I'll just say my generation when I entered the workforce. And then for those of us who are managing those much younger folks, it pushes our agility to get us to think differently and to adapt and adopt in a different way. And it's also to bring them, I'll say, to meet in the middle or the happy place, because they do exist.
Okay, thank you, Beth. Dr. Kelly, do you want to add anything to what Beth said about generational divide? Otherwise, I have another question for you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Again, that is a good question. Okay, and I do believe that there is a generational divide, and it has to do with well, our generation. I'm myself. I am a baby boomer, right? And and based on just last week's discussion with some people, baby boomers, they view work as adventurous, right? Generation Y, it's a mean to an end. X, view work as a necessity. So it is some gaps, when it comes to the generations. When it comes to communication, there's also some differences. Baby boomers, again, we prefer face-to-face, communication. The generation Y, they prefer texting and social media and those types of things, right? And Generation Z, they, also prefer face-to-face communication, such as video conferencing and those types of things, whereas the traditionalists prefer communication. So there is definitely some gaps as it relates to generations.
Good point. Thank you, Dr. Kelly. Let me follow up with one question. Start with you, and then I'll request Beth and Terry to respond to it. A colleague of mine who I respect a lot, he just sent a question, and he says that his thought is that if people work well in the office environment, they will also work well in the home environment. If they don't work well in the office, they're not going to work well in the home either. So it's not really about the remote or not remote. It's about a good employee is always a good employee. Is it that simple, or are there other factors we should be considering? Let me start with Kelly, and then Terry and Beth.
Who'd you say start with?
Start with you, Kelly, Dr. Kelly. Yes.
Okay.
If you're an employee, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much. Again, that's a good question. But I think there is so many factors, right, that comes into play, as it relates to, it depends on, our terminology of what a good employee and a bad employee really is. Because a person may have an issue at work, doesn't mean that they are a bad employee. I think that what I have seen and what I have noticed, especially, in our Social Security administration, productivity has gone up tremendously, with those claim examiners and people that do that type of work, and I don't think it has anything to do with whether you're a good employee or bad employee, but a lot of factors come into play. A lot of times a person just work better when there is not any external distractions, okay? It could be, from where I said, a lot of times what I see is a lot of harassment going on the job site, right? And that kind of has to do with a person's level of performance, right? But get them away from that environment and you'll see a whole different employee. It could be not just the supervisor, it could be another employee. It could be a person having to worry about whether or not the child is taken care of properly. It's a lot of things that come into play. But in this environment where they're in a COVID environment and they're actually working at home and the child is right there with them, they don't have that distraction. They don't have that to worry about. And so they end up being a very productive employee, and it has nothing to do with whether or not they're a good employee or bad employee, but just given a different environment and a different set of circumstances, and you get better productivity.
Tojo, you got your mic off.
Thank you for pointing it out. Yeah, very quickly, will Beth and Terry like to respond to that? Good employee is a good employee no matter where.
So I'll start. Well, Tojo, we see this even with our grad students. I don't think it's as simple as that, because there's two dynamics here that really come to the forefront. One is, if you're working remotely, you have to be a self-starter. You know, you have to be somebody who has the skill sets to avoid the distractions, whether it's the cat walking across the keyboard or the 7-year-old who keeps popping their head in or something like that. But there is a level of being a self-starter and be able to concentrate that's a little different in being in the office environment, which is a more controlled space. The other element, and Toja, I know we see this in graduate students. There are students with different types of learning. There are some students that we deal with, that I deal with in my center, and I have seen it back in my professional career in the private sector, who give them an assignment and they want to go out and figure it out for themselves. They want to, you know, whether it's a new, you know, technique or data analysis style or some, they want to figure it out themselves, versus the ones that really want somebody kind of standing next to them, maybe not, you know, maybe figuratively rather than literally, but, you know, working through them. And I think that one of the things that we're going to have to do in HR management within all sectors of the economy is have better systems for identifying the employees that will have those skill sets, those innate traits that lend themselves better to one form or another, but then provide training to them so that they can overcome some of those, you know, those challenges that they may have, that, you know, so that you can say that you can effectively work. Now, having said that, if under the ideal circumstance, a lot of that gets taken care of through self-selection, because the folks that really would prefer to engage, say like a student that would prefer to engage with you or I, Tojo, personally, they're going to choose in-person classes versus online learning.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Good point, Terry. Anything you'd like to add, Beth?
Just very quickly, I would say, if I go back to my, you know, sort of basketball analogy, and I think that I don't think it's as simple as, if I'm a good worker at work, I'm going to be a good worker at home, because I do think it's your surroundings that contribute, and it's sort of, I'm hearing myself say it depends, but you know, it really depends on so many other things, like, you know, some of the things that both you know, Terry and Dr. Kelly have said. And I think it's also transparency and accountability, because, you know, what motivates you doesn't motivate me, et cetera. And so the more transparent, the more accountable people are, and I think the more sort of on task they'll stay, generally speaking. And certainly as in the contractor world, you know, we're focused on deliverables and things like that, and timelines. And so there's you know, we almost self-police in a way, because you're all focused on, you know, achieving the end goal.
Yeah, and Tojo, there's another thing that comes out. Your physical space at home also becomes a critical factor. I'm looking around, and Dr. Kelly and Beth, I mean, we're all sitting in dedicated space within our homes that we can say is an office, right? If I am a young couple living in a 1-bedroom condo or town or apartment or something, and one of us is at the kitchen table and one of us has got a lap desk sitting in the living room, that's a lot different circumstances. And then this gets into the thing about the degree to which we move down this pathway, how it changes our demand for the type of housing that we live in.
Yeah. Good point, Terry. Well, I want to keep the last 5 minutes for JJ to make some concluding comments. So the remaining 5 minutes I've got, I want to make the best use of it. So here is one very good question I've just seen, and the person asked, will the Zoom environment, or, you know, the virtual environment, create additional glass ceiling for people wanting to move up to upper management or any kind of professional growth? And I've heard this question come up in many forums. You know, what happens if I'm not seen? Because we've always assumed that, you know, professional advancement is a social process. You know, if you're not seen, you don't exist. And seeing in Zoom is not the same as seeing in person. And what are your thoughts about that? Any of you can comment with any specific, you know, example or ideas?
I'm happy for Terry to start.
Go ahead, Terry. Do you have anything that you've seen in this area?
No, I have not seen specific, but just say that you're seeing emerge, and I just hear this anecdotally and a bit different. You go into some meetings, we've all done this, to where folks are more comfortable because, you know, whatever their circumstance, you just get their name up on the screen, or they have a fixed picture or something like that, you know, and they don't want to be distracted or whatever. But there is what we call media richness, right? You know, and the media richness is your ability to pick up visual cues. I don't see any way that you can equate a Zoom where everybody's off campus or off camera, or some people are, with getting that media richness, conveying all the communication methods. Now, the degree to which that we have to be careful of, are there people that have that because of, you know, qualified reasons to be concerned about that issue, and therefore as managers we have to be specifically trained on not inserting our own biases in that. So this is work that has to be done not by the worker, but by the managers that need to be able to address these issues, because there is a central fairness to be able to say, no, I don't want to be on camera.
Good point. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was going to, so this whole, I'll call it notion of unconscious bias, I think is real and exacerbated by Zoom. And, you know, I will say, going back to maybe some of the questions that, you know, we talked about before, and sort of where are people sort of, you know, mentally and you know, from a stress perspective and everything happening at home. And there, it's really important for organizations to reach out to their people, talk about unconscious bias, talk about inclusive leadership, talk about, you know, it's okay to be off Zoom, but it's, you know, maybe it's not okay all the time to be off Zoom because you need the, you know, the interaction that Terry mentions. But if you've got, like, hey, if it's just I'll call it a staff meeting or something, we're just going to say no camera. Like, don't worry about, you know, it's no camera. So then everybody knows no camera. Everybody knows where the boundaries are. And so that will help, you know, maybe not eliminate, but minimize this sort of unconscious bias. But again, I think that these are deliberate actions that must be taken with the, you know, your workforce to actually talk about these things. Or else, you know, we all just default to getting the work done and do what we need to do and saying, oh, look, Fred's never on camera. You know, what's going on with him? And it's like, well, you don't know, but it's probably okay. But if it's not okay, you also want to know that, you know, does he need additional help? And so again, it's this much broader conversation. It's a much more empathetic conversation. It's a much more inclusive conversation. So, you know, I really don't, I'll say, don't know if there's a glass ceiling issue or a, but I worry about it if we're not taking some of these other steps.
Sure. Thank you, Beth. Well, the last question is something that I have connected with personally as well. We always talk about reframing, and one of our students is asking, you know, what is the upside to this? You know, we have talked about a lot of, I don't think we talked about only downside, but is there an upside to this that will students, graduate of the Shar School and other universities, be able to anticipate and prepare for a preferred work environment, you know, and or what should they do to prepare themselves for a new work environment? I see that we have just 4 minutes left, so maybe just one of you take this question, and then I will ask JJ to conclude this panel. And I've not been able to get to all the questions. There are some very insightful questions coming up. It's just the lack of time, but this question, what is upside to this? Will one of you take this, and then I would pass to JJ. Dr.
Well,
Kelly,
I'd be interested to hear what Beth and Dr. Kelly both have to say, but I'd tell you just real briefly, I think that we will see net productivity gains. I think some of those gains will, and I think we will see better, as we get used to it and figure it out, better work and home life balances will become more possible. I think that will lead to better outcomes. I think workers will continue to have, particularly the workers with the right skills, will have additional power in the workplace and be able to maybe negotiate for better compensation packages, or, if you will, that entire compensation about, you know, the allowance for work and when you have to be where. I think that it, you know, and perhaps it's a reallocation of how we spend our money in society, in the sense of maybe we spend money less on gasoline and automobiles, and have to have less road infrastructure if we're commuting less. I mean, so there's going to be some adaptations, and that's not necessarily saying that everybody benefits, but I think in the overall system, this is a productivity enhancing approach that allows us to better deal with the downsides of specific geography.
Very good. Thank you. Well, quickly, Dr. Kelly, Beth, anything you want to say? Then I transition to JJ.
Beth first.
Upside, yes.
Beth, you may go first.
No, I'll just associate myself with Terry's comments. They were great.
Well, let me just say this then. As far as relates to the federal government, the federal government is sometimes a leader, and sometimes it's a model employer, and sometimes it follows the private sector, right? As a matter of fact, Google has extended universal telework or remote work rather until September of 2021. Then it says it will do a hybrid model that requires employees to live in commuting distances, but allow everyone to work at home 2 days a week, as Beth has talked about earlier, right? The plan is to test that hybrid model, and I think that something similar should be tested for the federal government, right? So I'm actually saying that we have opportunities here, right? We should take that into consideration. I think that the data from the pandemic need to be, asterisk at the bottom, reminding us that it occurred under a, president that kept agencies understaffed and tied their hands when it came to carry out the agency mission. But, with the new administration and doing away with these executive orders, give us, a new and a better opportunity to really excel. And so I think that what we will see is the federal government excelling under these particular situations and circumstances. So I just want to leave it with that. But thank you so very much for asking that question.
Well, that's a nice way to conclude our discussions as I hand it back to JJ. I also want to acknowledge my colleague Brian Barr, who is Associate Director of Career Services and Alumni Relations. He has been helping me sort through all these questions. There are so many questions here, and without his help, I couldn't have done it. JJ, your time to conclude.
Thank you, Tojo. And I just want to thank everybody for the moderator, obviously, Tojo, and for the rest of the panelists for an outstanding discussion. Obviously, this topic is just getting started and will continue into the future. So I look forward to the SHAR School being able to continue to participate and provide some thought leadership as we continue to navigate this space. So thank you all for your participation. I would like to thank also Brian Barr and the staff of SHAR, who have been very helpful today, but also in preparing for this event, making sure that everything was organized and ready. As a reminder, we are recording this event, and after some review, it will be uploaded to the SHAR website, and we'll be able to provide that information. And I did want to also encourage folks again to stay connected with the SHAR School for future activities and events that we have ongoing. Brian will be sharing that link again in the chat. And one more plug for our Student Emergency Assistance Fund for those students that are challenged during this time, for our alumni that are in positions where they may be able to contribute. We will share that link again. So thank you all again. Wonderful discussion, and I look forward to more in the future.
Thank you, everyone. And to my
Thank you.
audience. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right. Now, folks, thanks a lot. I think you stopped recording, Brian? No.